Hi, everybody. Just gonna adjust my chair a little bit. Welcome to Thursday Charla. I'm just gonna fix that. Hey, everybody. Hi. You guys can see all my stuff in the back, my kids' crafts. Marce, I'm letting you on. Oh, there you are.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
I'm good. Oh, hey, Z.
Hi. Welcome to Thursday Charla. It's 8:05 right now. We're a couple of minutes late. I was like, I'm going to be on time. I'm super glad that you guys are able to join us today because I'm pretty excited about this one. We've got some really heavy topics, a very heavy topic that we're going to cover. So we're going to give everybody a couple of minutes to hop on. Hi, everybody.
My mom's being really extra. She's like waving, and I'm like, hi, Mother.
I love that. That's so cute. So happy Thursday. It's almost the end of the week. How are you doing? Let's do a quick temperature check.
I'm doing good. Yeah, it's been a busy week, but it's been good. Yeah, I like the weather. I thrive in rainy weather. Like, I definitely should move to Vancouver. But my friend that lives there, Melissa, she's like, you love it, and then you end up hating it. I'm like, that's fair. That's fair. Too much of a good thing, right? How about you?
I'm having a good day. So anybody who doesn't already know, I've been feeling a little spread thin. So I started drawing some much needed boundaries and just being like a little bit more like guarded with my time. And I'm really grateful for that. I'm just like giving myself space and I'm feeling really good about it.
Good.
Feeling super good. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's always a good thing.
Yeah. I'm gonna give everybody like 2 more minutes, see who hops on, and I think we should maybe hop into it. Hey, Knisha. Any wins this week?
You're asking me,
wins? I'm asking you.
So sorry.
I'm
like,
asking
what
you.
it is. I don't
and also,
know
if
why.
anybody else has any wins that they want to celebrate, feel free to share
Yes,
them.
please share them. I don't know why. You always ask me this question, and for some reason, I always freeze, and it's horrible because I obviously don't think enough about my wins. I bought bathing suits. I know I was telling you about that, so that's exciting. So yeah, bathing suits. It's always a good thing, and like I bought 2 of them for like $45. So I think that's not too bad price-wise, right?
That is dope.
I'm pretty excited. I know I always talk about this, and I know we had like kind of a fantasy, but also kind of plans. They weren't concrete, but we did talk about going to Cuba with your boys sometime either last year or this year. And like, I'm planning on going to Cuba at the end of this year. We will see what COVID has to say. But that's what it is. Yeah. That's
Sam says her scooter is fixed.
I saw that.
Oh, I'm so glad. Sam's been having a hard time with your scooter. I'm super stoked about it. Oh, my thing doesn't want to stay up like this. You're just gonna annoy me, camera. There we go. That works.
And Kanish got up this morning, so that's a win.
Yeah.
So you ready to
yeah.
invite
So
our special guest?
I think we should hop into it. So there are some big conversations that are being had around some of the civil unrest that we're seeing in Cuba right now. We're seeing hashtags like SOS Cuba that are trending, and it's causing people have some thoughts on it. And we have found that there's been a lot of misinformation going around. Some of it's quite concerning because some of this information is causing people to want to get politically involved. The trouble is that if you are not familiar with Latin American history, and you don't have to be a white person to perpetuate imperialism or colonialism, if you're not familiar with your history, but you're advocating for like American interventionism in a sovereign country, that's harmful. So we've been having a lot of conversations about, you know, the importance of familiarizing yourself with history before you start commenting on it. And, you know, how sometimes we need to think critically about the sources that we're getting our information from. And so with that in mind, I am super excited because we've got a special guest today. Just in love with this person. So her name is Ana Ruiz Aguirre. She is a Cuban-Canadian researcher. This person is a communication specialist. They are a digital strategist. I'm super excited to have them join us here. So I'm going to send out a quick invitation. Invite, send request. Now, we've never had like a guest on before. So if there are any technical difficulties.
Hi! We did it! So exciting!
Hi! I'm so glad to see you.
I was raging like 2 seconds ago, and seeing you guys' face, like it's awesome. I'm no longer raging that much.
As much. Yeah.
As much.
Put a little damper on it. How are you? Real quick, temperature check. How are you doing? Aside from the
I am, well, all things considered, I'm doing well. I just went to see the Black Everyday exhibition at the AGA, and it was beautiful. That calmed me down a lot. It was great. It was great to see them get out of the basement to which it had been relegated for like 5 years. And it was actually really funny, non sequitur, because I talked to the curator at some point, and he was like, we didn't even realize that we were in the basement, and it wasn't an exhibition space until some staff went by, and they were like, how you like the basement? Apparently. Yeah. Anyway, so so I went, I saw, it was wonderful, and then I got home to the news that Biden had announced new sanctions against Cuba, and I was like, yay.
Yeah. Like that. So deadpan.
I mean, at this point, we're kind of trained, but anyways, I know you guys have questions. I also have like a lot of notes. There's a lot of stuff to go through. So let's give her.
I love it. Okay. So one of the things that we're hearing right now is that people are protesting the Cuban government. So Cuba obviously is a one-party political country, and Marcela and I have discussed this quite at length. Now you, just to give everybody a little bit of background about you and why we wanted to talk to you specifically, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your relationship with Cuba.
Cool. Okay. So I love Cuba. I was born there. I grew up there. So my bias is heavily like pro-Cuba. I don't want intervention. I don't want any of that stuff. So that's where I'm coming from. As a person who lives in the diaspora, because I have been living in Canada since I was 18 years old, it's a difficult line to navigate because a lot of the people who are in the diaspora in Cuba, they have a lot more play than the people who live in Cuba. And there's an editorial line that you have to follow in order to be accepted, say, in Canadian universities or in Canadian media. And you have to repeat things like referring to the Cuban government as a regime or a communist regime, all of which are like misnomers. But anyway, so I was in like my first year of law school in Cuba when my mom decided to move us to Canada. So I moved here. And I wasn't really that political when I moved, but then I got here in my first class at Cuban University. The poli sci professor was teaching basically the theory of Che Guevara, saying that it was fascism, like next to Mussolini. Jeez. And I threw the biggest fucking fit. I almost borderline like went back to Cuba. Like it was not like I just couldn't deal. And from that moment, I was like, no. So my mission basically since like 2007, when that throwdown happened at Cuban, has been to rectify as much as possible all of the misinformation about Cuba. And that has been really hard. Like, for instance, I haven't completed my PhD yet because my supervisors at Queen's University basically censored me. They told me that I could not use documentation published in Cuba. I could not use books published in Cuba. I could not use government sources from Cuba because, according to them, those were not reliable.
They're biased.
Well, not even. They just said they were completely illegitimate. Those were not sources.
That's even worse.
Yes.
Right.
So basically, my entire dissertation was based on that. That got blocked, so I'm waiting for them to die of natural causes, of course.
You're not planning anything? Yeah, I get it.
I'm not planning anything. Just like waiting it out. And then we'll see. So that's where I'm at. I mostly look at legislation pertaining to art. So I'm an art writer. I mostly write about art in context. So my practice is not really to talk about the formal qualities of a piece, like, oh, what a beautiful palette and use of color, although that's very valid and I completely appreciate that. But what I look at is like, what's the legislation surrounding the commercialization of pieces? What artwork gets into the gallery? What artwork doesn't? How is it sold? And so I started looking at the legislation, extraterritorial legislation of the United States that impacted Cuba entering the international art market. And that was a rabbit hole that I couldn't get out because the US blockade is like hundreds and hundreds of pieces of legislation, which nobody wants to read, of course, because it's legislation. But thankfully, I'm a nerd, so I did.
I love that. Okay.
Yeah.
So that is a very interesting pathway into, I guess, the work that you do now, but also just, the way that we get to having these kinds of conversations about, the legitimacy of certain, information resources and who gets to be the arbiter of what is considered a legitimate information resources and what isn't, which is ironic to me because there are so many press companies that own these large NGOs that we refer to as these international experts on things like human rights and on things like policy, right, foreign policy and that kind of thing. And so when we're talking about them, it's really important to remember that many of these NGOs are funded by American billionaires, right? And so when we're thinking about the information that comes out of them, it's really important to remember that someone is always benefiting from any piece of information that we're producing. Who is benefiting from the information that we're quoting when we're talking about Cuba specifically? So some people that have tuned in today might not be super familiar with the Cuban embargo. So super quick, high-level overview. The Cuban embargo was not actually, it didn't actually start with Fidel Castro. It was actually the first embargo against Cuba was imposed in March of 1958 against the previous dictator Fulgencio Batista, and it was imposed again 2 years later after the Cuban Revolution had led to Batista's deposition. What is interesting to me is that so first off, this really was the embargo in 1960 really was a response to the fact that the Cuban government had nationalized all of these American companies that had been operating in Cuba and had been exploiting resources. There were, abuses against the population. There were, really significant discrepancies between, the working class and the wealthy, and that, gap was widening. There was literally like gangsters, like the mafia owned.
Lucky Luciano. If you go to Havana and you go to really nice hotels, those were the people who built them. The whole, I think it was the fourth movie of The Godfather, and what's the name of that guy who was hot and they were all in Cuba? That actually happened. That's the thing that happened.
Yeah, so it's really important to give this context when we're talking about how the embargo came to be. Now, the Cuban embargo is currently it is the longest it's the longest standing embargo, the longest standing sanction against any country in modern history. It
Yep.
has been criticized routinely since the early 90s, 1992. The United Nations basically criticizes it every single year, like a tradition. They're just like, oh, it's that time again, and nobody does anything about it. Justin
Yep.
Trudeau, who famously now is like lending his support to the Biden administration, who has, like you were stating previously, they've just added more restrictions to the embargo. You know, on the one hand, they support the Biden administration, but then every year there's always every year when Trudeau addresses the UN, he's always talking about how the embargo is. You know, how the embargo is, you know, effectively genocide against the Cuban people, how we need to lift the embargo, that kind of thing. Always falling short of actually using the word genocide, but it's really important that we call it what it is.
It is.
It is genocide. It is genocide by definition. So, so for anybody who, you know, is not super familiar with how the embargo came to be, that's what it is. There were a number of conflicts, you know, after that, you know, there was the invasion of the Bay of Pigs that happened during the Kennedy administration in 1962 that led to the Americans were humiliated. So then after that, the embargo was basically extended to include almost all exports. And that's really important to remember. There are many people who will argue that the embargo no longer prohibits the trade of food and humanitarian supplies. And that might be technically true.
It is really.
It really isn't. Anna, can you tell us a little bit about that? Can you tell us why that's not true? Can you enlighten us?
That is not true. Yeah, sure. That's really not true at all. Like, so all of the sanctions that conform the trade embargo, they're legislation that have been passed in Congress. So they cannot be lifted. I heard a lot of people when Obama was in power saying, oh, the embargo is lifted. No president can lift it. The only thing that they can do is basically like not apply the legislation. So if you go through that legislation, which is very comprehensive, some of the things that are really important is, one, Cuba cannot trade in US dollars internationally. They can't. And when you say it like that, people are like, well, you know, you could trade in like pesos or rubles or like whatever other thing. But the thing is, 80% of all international transactions are conducted in US dollars. So just by that, Cuba is like completely excluded from 80% of the international trade.
Yeah.
So everything gets more expensive. Absolutely everything. Like shipment, well, and I'm not even going to get into the shipping. That's just transactions. So like, for instance, the same thing is applied to Venezuela currently. Venezuela bought into COVAX, and the U.S. basically froze their payments, the Venezuela payments to COVAX, and Venezuela doesn't have any vaccines now because COVAX will not send them the vaccine unless they can pay, and they can't pay because they cannot trade in US dollars because the US can freeze the accounts. Extraterritorially, it doesn't even have to go through the US to do it, which is part of the illegality of it all. So say if you want to buy food with US dollars, can't. If you want to buy medication with US dollars, can't. The other issue, no. The other issue is transportation. Let's say that by some miracle, Cuba is able to like pay in rubles and buy some stuff from Russia. Russia's like far, right? And you cannot buy the oil. You have to buy the oil in rubles, and then you have to figure out how a ship can get from Russia to Cuba without touching anywhere that the US happens to be at. And if all of that happens, and the ship by some miracle goes through the actual naval blockade that the US has around the island, because remember, we have like borders, they're in the sea, but there are borders. So there's actual ships there blockading Chinese shipments coming into the island with syringes. So let's assume that all of that is not a problem and the medication like finally gets to Cuba. Cuba has absolutely no guarantee that that medication is not going to be tainted. Absolutely none. Biden just released the guy who introduced dengue in Cuba and killed like 100 people. Dude had like 2 life sentences from some, you know, the Supreme Court or whatever. And Biden, through presidential decree, was like, oh, you know, we'll let you go. You know, it's fine. You just murder a whole bunch of kids. It's all good. Kind of like the same thing that the Canadian government is doing to all the people who they knew killed those children. And they're around in Ottawa. There's a report about it. They're not doing shit. Anyway, the other problem, past the shipment, so there's a currency problem. there's a shipment problem, and then there's also the fact that Cuba cannot purchase anything that has 10% US made anything. So say the Cuban government wants to buy medical equipment. That medical equipment needs to be literally like 100% made in China. That means no parts can be even touched by the US. Materials cannot come from the US. That company cannot trade with the US because part of the US trade embargo is like you either trade with us or you trade with Cuba. And Cuba's broke for all of the things that we've already discussed, right? Like we're broke. So if you're given the option of dealing with a market that had like 300 million people and a shit lot of cash, or Cuba with 11 million people and no money, every single company will be like, no, we'll take the US. So what happens is, say, everything works out. Cuba gets like the 100% Chinese made whatever thing. And then the company that made the Chinese made equipment all of a sudden gets purchased by a US company. Guess what? Cuba cannot buy replacement parts.
Yeah.
And you're stuck with like millions of dollars of equipment just fucking sitting there. Pardon my French.
So you can curse away.
So when they say that it doesn't include medication, it doesn't include food, that is a lie. And I think that partially it's because the legislation is so complicated, you know, like because people are like, oh, well, you know, it's like it's a blockade of Cuba to the US to Cuba, right? So it's only bilateral. But that's not the problem. It gets condemned in the United Nations because it is extraterritorial, which is illegal in international law. And they just keep doing it because they're the US and they control the international market. How they control the internet, which is why you see all the misinformation. So
that actually is a great segue for a question that I wanted to ask. About we're hearing a lot of people that are talking about how the Cuban government has shut down the internet. They're censoring everybody. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, they should. They really should do that. Because what's happening right now, and you mentioned when we started like the SOS, hashtag SOS Cuba. So let me pull this back and like let you know how this started. So beginning of July, like this, mind you, has been going on for ages, but the last time this misinformation campaign happened, which I'm assuming it was like around Elian, like early 2000s, social media wasn't as much of a thing as it is right now.
Right.
But now it is. And the US controls the internet, and the US Congress allocates between $20 million and $50 million every single year to promote democracy in Cuba. Also, not like this is not hidden anywhere. This is in Congress budgets, like everywhere. You can look it up. And they were like, oh no, we want to like promote democracy. And all that money goes to companies in Miami who are not going to buy arms because that's not the world that we're living in right now. They are just going to pull fake information to social media to convince people of their point of view so that they don't have to go into Cuba and invade. You know, it's going to be the people. It's going to be like a thing that happens organically, you know, and it just happens in the population. So they started the SOS Cuba campaign like 3 or 4 days before July 11th on Twitter. And they were like, oh no, this is like completely organic. But of course, now there's proof that they changed the GPS in the tweets. They said that they were coming from inside of Cuba, but they were actually coming from media companies in Madrid and in Miami. So all of the things, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll let you finish.
So all of these tweets go out and they're like, SOS Cuba, like Matanzas, which is a province. Like it's basically like the tourism hub is where Varadero is where all the Canadians go. Matanzas is having like a COVID crisis. There are so many COVID deaths. Mind you, this is coming from the government who does not allow syringes to enter Cuba. But now they're concerned because the cases are going up, even though the cases are going up at a way slower rate than in the US, who has absolutely no problems getting syringes or vaccines or anything else. But anyway, SOS Matanzas. We have a crisis, like they're dying. We need to intervene. Within like 2 days, it was like nobody's talking about Matanzas anymore. They already started asking for like a military intervention. So people are on the streets, and these people, now they have lists circulating saying that there's missing people. There's no missing people. Like I know people who are on that list, and they're texting me being like, what the hell? Like I'm not, I am working in the television, what is happening? And I'm like, dude, I have no idea. So anyway, they're circulating those lists, but those people are like in jail. They're accounted for. And the international relations minister of Cuba just went out after Biden said what he said just today. And he was like, yo, if you produce some proof, bud, we'll talk. Give me proof. Give me some proof. And of course I can't produce it because there's no proof. So anyway, on the 11th, all of these people who were in the streets, it was not organic. They were paid. They've already confessed. The trials are going to be televised. There's over 500 people, and they were getting paid like about $100 to go out and like punch a police officer. I think $100 for a police officer, like $20 if you threw a cocktail Molotov. And these are people from Miami texting their families, this many. Those are also public now. They're just like, hey, there was one that was awful. It was like, if you beat up a kid, I'll give you like $100. But you have to beat him up and then cry and say, the police beat him up. Actually, they did that with a guy, and they filmed like a whole bunch of ketchup like on the floor. And then the guy shows up, no harm, no nothing, no scars, nothing, like on television going like, yeah, that didn't happen. Just, I got $100 kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
And of course, they're targeting like really, really vulnerable populations. Because these things are not happening in like the neighborhoods of people who are like workers or anything like that. They're going to like the places that are like really, really rough. And I mean, Cuba is not a paradise. There are rough places, and there is like a division between classes that has been growing since the 90s. That's undeniable. And we don't like it. That's just like how things are right now. So they're going to those neighborhoods. They're targeting those kids, like 13-year-old kids. This has been like completely awful. And they're giving them money so they go out and then vandalize stores. They even threw stones at a pediatric hospital with children inside. And then, of course, like CNN and Fox News and everybody's like, no, but the protests were organic. And they were completely pacific. Like there was no harm. There was no violence. Nobody was doing anything. And of course, to illustrate the pacifism, they used images of the pro-government manifestations that people went to after all of this violence happened on July 11th. It was so disgusting. Like if you look at Fox News, you will see how they blank out the signs. And they blanked them down because the sign said Fidel.
Yeah.
And they also don't put the audio because the audio says Fidel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's, yeah. Okay. So this, I mean, all of this, it really shouldn't come as a surprise. It doesn't surprise me, but it's still like, it doesn't surprise me that it's happening, but it's still shocking, you know? Yeah. You know, like it's still like really disappointing. And at the same time, you know, I think it just kind of speaks to how, you know, here in the West, right, in Canada and the United States, you know, we are very, very comfortable exploiting people for the sake of winning a fucking argument. Because that's ultimately what it is. This isn't out of concern for like Cubans. This is, this is for the sake of being right. And so, you know, so there are a couple of points that I want to touch on. One of the things that, you know, you talked about was the criticism that the embargo has received every year. There was a Cuban minister, he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Felipe Perez Roque, who he quoted, it was like a very famous memo that had gone out in the 1960s. It had come out from, I think it was the desk of, who was it? It came out of the CIA, where they basically, he had criticized the embargo at the United Nations very famously, just, I think it was in 2017 or something like that, for this, and he had cited this memo where the CIA had basically, like their stance had been that they needed to crush this particular administration using any means necessary and at any personal cost to the Cuban people, right? This is not a matter of like, like, it's not a matter of like taking like moral high ground. It's literally a matter of like control over Latin American countries, which we've seen, you know, I mean, it keeps happening. I mean, we can even look at, you know, what's happening in Haiti right now. You know, and so for anybody who is not aware with, you know, what's happening in Haiti right now, the Haitian president, Jovenel Moïse, was assassinated. They, you know, arrested a bunch of Colombian military personnel who are being accused of his murder, though that hasn't been, it hasn't been confirmed that it was a Colombians one way or another. The Colombians who were arrested admitted to having received U.S. military training while they were members of the Colombian Armed Forces. Among some of the commanders who were arrested is a Special Commander Grosso Guarin, who was once assigned to the Urban Anti-Terrorist Special Force Group. He carried out, as part of his mandate, he carried out kidnappings and assassinations. Another person who was arrested in Haiti from the Colombian military was Francisco Ladeo Ribe Ochoa, who is a Colombian commander. He was arrested in Haiti and it was previously investigated for something called false positives. And it's where the Colombian military, who they were given kill quotas by the United States and incentivized with bonus pay and vacation time. In order to meet those kill quotas, would assassinate civilians and then disguise them to look like members of FARC. The Colombian military is currently accused of killing, I think it's like something like 64, 6,500, something like that, civilians in this particular practice. So, I mean, if we want to talk about, you know, moral high ground, if we want to talk about, you know, the way that the United States has historically operated in Latin America, you know, we see here that, you know, the military in a number of Latin American countries continue to be trained by American mercenaries. They are paid to carry out special forces while they are still serving under what is supposed to be a sovereign nation's military, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if we look at Cuba, historically speaking, and if we're looking at it from, you know, within, you know, the context of American imperialism, it's not a stretch to say that this isn't like beneath them. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is such like a stereotypical American thing to do, right? And it's interesting to me that we're seeing the SOS Cuba by, you know, mostly, I would say, mostly well-meaning, but like wildly uneducated North Americans who, you know, are talking about, you know, intervention. And as someone whose like family history is literally written in displacement and genocide, like, this is a huge problem for me. And it's a huge problem for me that people are commenting on this without having like a full understanding of what it means when you are calling for American interventionism in Latin America. So one of the things that I find really curious is that among these, you know, well-meaning but wildly uneducated, let's just call them white people because it's bullshit. You know, what we're seeing is people that are talking about racism in Cuba and systemic discrimination against Black people. And this is really interesting to me because I'm not going to sit here and pretend that racism doesn't exist in all of Latin America. We are a colonized people, and colonization and imperialism was built on slavery in Latin America, and it was built on the genocide of indigenous peoples. We can just start with that. This is such like a deeply rooted problem that it's going to take a long time to resolve. And racism absolutely still does exist.
Totally.
And the fact is that everywhere in Latin America where you have a closer proximity to whiteness, chances are you are also more economically advantaged. Welcome to the rest of the world.
Yep.
The problem that I have is that people are looking at racism in Cuba through a very North American lens. And when they're looking at it and they talk about systemic discrimination, I'm like, I don't know that systemic discrimination is necessarily the right word for.
It really is.
yeah, it's not. And so to argue that it is to basically co-opt the issues that we're experiencing here in North America with racism, and trying to apply the same principles to an analysis of like race relations in Latin America, which is, and in Cuba specifically. And Cuba is very distinct because of the way that the government works there. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
So I guess the first thing that I would like to say is that there is racism in Cuba. Of course there is. The issue is, I guess not the issue, but like the difference is that it is not institutionalized. Whereas in the US it is institutionalized, racism in Cuba is not. The racism that's left over, and I'm not saying that it's insignificant, but the racism that's left over, it resides with the population. So for example, my grandmother, who was a Spanish immigrant, she is a racist person. My grandpa was Black. He could never admit that he was Black his entire life. But that is like a completely different generation. Completely. Like my generation, I can honestly say that I didn't even think about what color I would like put myself in until I arrived in Canada and people started asking me, what are you? You look so exotic. And then I would say Cuban, they were like, oh, but you don't look Cuban. I'm like, what the fuck does that mean? Like Cubans come in like every single color and size, and like, because we have been melded. So I guess with that, and racism in Cuba is different because of a whole bunch of historical conditions that don't necessarily start with the Cuban Revolution. I mean, the Cuban Revolution has been like super important in the fight against racism. And there is no government in Latin America that has been as Pan-African and pro-Africa as the Cuban government. In fact, one of the reasons why the US blockade is still there is because the Cuban government refuses to return Black Panthers. Oh. Shakur is in Havana. There's a bunch of Black Panthers who would be murdered on sight the second they stepped in the US, and the Cuban government refuses to let them go. That is badass. So racism in Cuba exists. I think it is kind of similar than the racism in Mexico in the sense that was established based on the melding of cultures. So we don't have an Aboriginal population anymore, at least not like a big representation of it. There are some pockets in the eastern provinces, but it's not like they're going extinct. And they were within like 2 or 3 years of the Spanish arriving because, you know, they were not used to like working the way these guys put them to work, which is why they imported a bunch of slaves, enslaved people from Western Africa. Mm-hmm. Right. So the issue with that was that unlike British colonies, the Spanish conquistadores, they basically had this idea that if they kept them all together, they would work better. So in Cuba, like the populations that were brought from Western Africa, they were kept in the same place. So the culture continued, which is why we have this like super weird syncretic culture in Cuba where people would pray to the Virgin Mary, but the Virgin Mary is also Ochun, you know, and it's the same thing. Like there's no differentiation. People go to Regla, which is a very famous church in Havana, to pray to Yemaya, which is an Orisha. Mm-hmm. So, you know, even culturally.
I just want to quickly add to that. So for, you know, on the, when we're talking about the preservation of African culture and African language, and you really, really do see that in Cuba, I have always loved, for anybody who is familiar with Latin music, Celia Cruz, who is a very, very famous Cuban singer. I grew up listening to her. Celia Cruz, I didn't learn this until right before she passed away. Celia Cruz had always sung in Yoruba, which is an African language. And so there are many people from the African diaspora that, you know, listen to Celia Cruz, not realizing that she was Cuban. You know, to them, they grew up listening to her songs, just like I grew up listening to, you know, Celia Cruz y la Sonora Matancera. So it's really, really cool when we look at the way that culture has evolved, not only in Cuba, but in Latin America in general, because we evolve differently. We mixed. Our relationship with indigeneity is very, very different from the relationship that North American people have, which is not to say that people don't identify as only indigenous in Latin America, but ours is more complicated. We certainly see more of that mestizaje, more of that blending of cultures. So anyway, that was my
yeah,
absolutely.
And also, like, to that, I would like to say, the first concert that I ever went to was a concert by this Cuban band named Synthesis, and they sang in Yoruba. They sang rock and roll, like rock, in Yoruba with electric guitars and everything. It was amazing.
Yeah.
It's still going. So yeah, like that mix in between. So basically, okay, the enslaved people arrived. The Spanish didn't brought their women, so they were like, okay, we might as well mix. And then everybody like intermarried. So in Cuba, there's a saying that if you don't, si no tienes de Congo, tienes de Carabalí, which means everybody's a natural descendant. Even if you look like see-through white, odds are you have some Africa in your background.
Yeah.
So I guess I grew up with that, and that intermixing gave rise to so many like tonalities of skin and like expression. But I think that one of the things that the Cuban government throughout the revolution has done very, very well is acknowledge not only the mestizaje, which was like basically the general discourse in Mexico to promote nation building after the Mexican Revolution. The Cuban Revolution did that to an extent, but they also reinforced each of the cultural groups from which Cuban culture comes from. So for instance, right now, and at the same hierarchy. So when you think of Cuban ballet right now, we have African ballet, and that's like a crew, and it fills like stadiums. And we have Spanish ballet with the Luis Alfonso company, and we have classical Russian ballet, which is kick-ass. And we have, there's another group. Anyway, but all of those are at the exact same level. They're all called the same thing. They all get the same amount of government funding. And the same thing with like religious organizations, like Afro-religious organizations, they have their place in the Cuban government. In fact, like every year they release what they call Letra del Año, which is basically like a prophecy for the rest of the year. And that gets broadcasted in Cuban television.
Awesome, yeah.
Every single year. Cool. So, you know, there are words like hacer, which are like the most Cuban thing that you can possibly say in this life right now. That's a Yoruba word. Actually, I think it's Igbo. But it's basically, it was taken, I mean, it's not exactly how it sounds in the original language, but it was a derivation from it. And it means just friend. And that's how you talk to people. You say, instead of saying, hey, bro, you say, hey, hacer. Oh, to be super Cuban, que hola hacer.
I love that.
That's amazing.
That's so
yeah.
Dope. That's so dope. Okay. So I think that's a really interesting point that I really wanted to clarify that when we're talking about racism within Cuba. So just to reiterate, just to kind of recap, racism still exists in Cuba. Racism exists in all of Latin America. We are not pretending that anti-Blackness does not exist in Cuba. But it's important to remember that if we're going to do like a racial analysis on relations in Cuba, it is possible to have race contradictions, and it is possible to have class contradictions. You know, even though Cuba is a communist country, you know, there are class contradictions within that, right? So there are class contradictions, there are racial contradictions, and these things are so deeply ingrained in our history. Cuba as a socialist country is very, very new. And it existed as a colony and, you know, later on a protectorate, but never really an independent nation until the revolution made it so. And so with that, because the revolution is still quite young, if we're looking at it in the grand scheme of things, you know, these are things that are going to take some time to resolve. So, but to suggest that American interventionism is required because race relations are so like out of hand, and that the division between the classes and the poverty and the need is like it is like so far gone because of the government is not only like it's not just like dishonest, but to say things like, well, the embargo doesn't affect food trade and the importation of medical supplies is also intellectually disingenuous. It's like it's not factoring in the more broad view that we have to have if we're going to talk about Cuba. So to anybody who was watching this, please, 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 please do your research. If you don't know what you're talking about, it's okay to sit down and say that you don't know what you're talking about. Literally, just sit the fuck down. Don't cause any more harm. And stop advocating for American interventionism. Nobody asked you. Nobody asked you. Nobody wants that. Sit down.
And to touch on Tanya's point, like, it's hilarious because when you look at the US and the way, like we were talking about this earlier, the way that they treat their African American citizens and the way that their racism is systemic, right? It's amazing that, like, nobody has ever said SOS America, you know, or what about the wealth disparity in the US where we have like people like Jeff Bezos who is flying out into outer space, and then you have people who literally are like living on the streets, you know. So it is really hypocritical of Americans, but that's the thing that I think gets me the most when it comes to Americans, when you have any kind of conversation about Cuba or about like their interventionism in Latin America, is they don't see past their nose. So for them, it's like, oh, we were there to help them. We did all this. And it's like, no, you really didn't. Like, your governments have actually perpetuated more harm and actually caused more genocide, more abuse, more of all of those things, more starvation. All of those things can be traced back to the US. So I think it's really fascinating that, you know, Americans never see how toxic, you know, they are, but then they notice it in other countries, you know, and they want to go help.
And, you know,
they
really,
want to go help.
Yeah, I think so many of these problems, you know, I mean, basically every problem that Cuba is facing right now can very easily be, if not entirely resolved, but at the very least remediated by removing the embargo.
Lifting the US trade embargo. Like, we have never, the fact that they say that socialism has failed, it's baffling to me, because you've never given a chance. Like, Cuba has never existed in normal conditions. Never. Not 1 year since the revolution. So you have no idea what we can do. And honestly, when they say that the Cuban government is like inefficient and can't deal with the situation, I'm like, dude, name me one government who could survive 60 years of attacks this comprehensive. What government can do that and create the first vaccine in all of Latin America and export doctors and vaccinate a larger percentage of their population than the US and have more animals and better educational systems?
Seriously,
you know,
give me goosebumps.
Latin America, so
you can't do it. It's not.
For anybody who's curious, Cuba has among the highest literacy rates, not just in Latin America, but in the world. Like, literally in the world. And this is like this tiny little island that the Americans are too afraid to bomb because it's in Florida's backyard. I also want to point out that anytime the Americans have placed an embargo against any country, any sort of a trade embargo, it has usually been because this country has refused to bend to their whims. I mean, there's been like a trade embargo on Venezuela since like 2019. And there was a trade embargo that was, there was a trade embargo that was put against Venezuela in 2019. I'm not actually sure if it's still in place. Do you know if it is?
It is in place.
It is still in place. Okay. So the United States had zero diplomatic relationships, had like no diplomatic relationship with Venezuela under the presidency of Nicolas Maduro. But they're like much more flexible under the currently disputed president, Juan Guaido in Venezuela. And the winner of that election has been challenged, and it has been suggested by a number of independent international organizations that is an illegitimate that is an illegitimate president, and that the elections were tampered with. So really, really important to remember. Again, it kind of goes back to that like American interventionism in Latin America and how they continue to just like, they just want to fuck around. They you know, Americans just like fucking around. This is just what they're good at. And you know, if we're going to talk about what it means to again, it ultimately comes back to having the higher moral high ground. You know, it's amazing to me that Cuba was able to develop the first vaccine in Latin America. I think they've developed something like 5 at this point, haven't they?
Yeah.
It's been 5 vaccines. Meanwhile, in the United States, because there is so much misinformation, there have been, in the United States, I think it's cases have tripled in the last 2 weeks. COVID cases have tripled in the last 2 weeks. And much of the misinformation is coming from like far-right evangelical sources, many of whom are some of the ones who were also funding the misinformation in Cuba. It's really important to remember that when we're looking at—
And the Proud Boys.
The Proud Boys, yeah.
And they're, and if we're looking at like Human Rights Watch, you know, who is among the loudest, they are among the loudest critics of the Cuban government. And in, you know, so Human Rights Watch is owned by a larger media conglomerate that is actually owned by Soros, right? So, you know, when we're thinking about who's actually making these criticisms in the United States, American intervention has never been for the benefit of anyone except for the rich white people in the USA, point blank. Asking for USA intervention anywhere is literally propaganda at its finest. That's from Kenesha. They're probably Nena Ramos says they're probably messing around now as the left is rising in South America. That's another really important point.
And that's when you consider like what happened in Guatemala and in El Salvador, it was because the left was rising. And so what did they do? Ronald Reagan. Like, that's the thing. They're terrified of the left. And when you consider that, when you think about all of the, you know, even like Latin America is by and large more conservative because of our ties to Catholicism. But the thing is, there have been like little upspurts of like leftism, right? But the US is so afraid of that that they always want to intervene whenever they get a whiff of that. And it's because of that that they've actually like perpetuated so much of this harm. And so it's interesting to me that like now that, you know, as Nena Ramos was saying, that all of these little things are happening with like more leftism rising in Latin America, they're freaking the fuck out, right? Because they're losing grasp on it. But the thing is, you cannot have a sustainable like country or sustainable society if you don't have at least like some parts of socialism. Like socialism is the way of the future. Like when you think about it, you know, free healthcare, free, you know, amenities, all of those things. If you can just take care of the basic human rights, we always talk about this on the Charla. If we just have the ability to cover everybody's basic human needs, we wouldn't have as much, you know, despair, as much depression, as many, you know, people living on the fringes. Like life would be so much easier if you actually had a way to live from one day to the next without having to worry about where your next meal is going to come from, right? So anyway, just my tangent. So thank you, Nena Ramos, for saying that.
That's a very good point. Because like also remember that there are like thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that do not have a home in the US. Exactly. And Cuba's homeless rate is...
Exactly. Thank you. Yes.
0. Totally. And you know, and this also trades into the trade embargo. Because one of the things that they want to do, which I find also hilarious, in the fact that they're like, oh, we're going to like, we're going to defend, like we're going into Cuba and we want to intervene in order to guarantee like basic human rights and like the rights of the oppressed Afro-descendants. Well, the thing is, that's not only hypocritical, but that makes absolutely no sense, because one of the things that you have already said publicly that you're going to do the second you go in is take away the land and give it back to the United Fruit Company. And give it back to the descendants of the, you know, mafiosos who built the hotels, because they have claims. That was one of the things Trump did. He activated the Title III of the Helms-Burton Law, which basically allows U.S. citizens to file a lawsuit against Cuba on U.S. court to get their shit back. So the daughter of Lucky Luciano, even though her property in Cuba was technically illegal, she has a claim. You know, she wants the hotels back. So you go wonder, like if you go and you intervene and you give all the lands and all the stuff to the people who had it previously, then, you know, like all of these Black Cubans who were given houses with the redistribution made by the revolution, where are they going to live? Mm-hmm. You know, where are the farmers going to live when you bring back the United Fruit Company and they take all of the hectares in Cuba? Where are these people going to go? How is that going to help equality? How is that going to help the rights of like Afro-Americans? Like, I don't get it. This is just dumb.
No, but you're right. And,
simple.
And
it's
you know,
simple.
and if the Americans were actually concerned, I mean, let's talk about actual interventionism. So right now, there have been almost no reports on in mainstream American media about what is happening in Colombia right now. In Colombia, as it stands, there have been anywhere between 300 to 500 deaths every day as a result of COVID. Okay, you're not seeing SOS Colombia with Americans talking about interventionism. You know, Colombia is not as attractive, and also the conflict in Colombia is literally funded by the Americans. It literally comes back to them.
And also the Colombian government has been like the US bitch for like so long, we can't even remember. Like,
Yeah.
you know, and I love Colombians, but like that's reality. That's where you guys are at. Just the same as Israel. Colombia and Israel, US bitches. And Ukraine. Sorry, I love Ukraine, but also true. You have an actor as a president, and you're the US bitch.
Yeah. And no, but you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, if we're looking at it really, if we're actually concerned about like human rights abuses, there have been hundreds of disappearances and human rights violations since the early days of the protests, right? Which have been going on for months now. There have been like zero calls for like any sort of sanctions against Colombia. They're also like not even like concerned with providing like adequate supports or aids to help manage the COVID crisis that's happening there. And in the meantime, I mean, the Americans are training Colombian military men to go assassinate Haitian presidents. That's where their priorities are. So if we're actually concerned about doing the right thing, if we're actually concerned about like humanitarian aid, if we're actually concerned about stabilizing Latin America, and that's the argument that everyone's making, you know, for in favor of invading Cuba, they're literally calling for the invasion of Cuba. I'm like, you know, the thing is that like the last time it happened, it didn't end very well for you. Like,
and also, what's the end?
The whole fucking island?
Yeah, and the end game, okay, you invade, okay? What's going to happen next? We're Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico's doing fucking awesome right now,
exactly.
right? Like,
Exactly.
because they can elect a president. Oh, no, wait, they cannot do that. They can trade externally. So what's the freedom here?
So for anybody who's not aware, prior to, Cuba was an American protectorate up until 1959. And at the time, it was basically from Cuba's independence of Spain. The American government helped they were basically there helping to provide resources to the Cuban Liberation Army that was looking to break free from being a Spanish colony. And they basically had their hand on the pot ever since then, right? So it's the same story with Puerto Rico. Who, you know, basically gained their independence from Spain only to become an American protectorate and to basically have like zero agency over its own government, over its own people, you know, zero ability to like any self-determination. And that is the reason that the Cuban Revolution took place, like, to begin with. It was because Cuba belonged to Cubans, and Cuba wanted to have self-determination, and Cuba wanted a Cuba that, like, Cubans wanted a Cuba that was for them, not that was going to be exploited for resources. And I just realized I'm like explaining Cuban history to you. I'm just going to shut my mouth.
No, that is awesome. That's 100%. That's exactly what happened. And honestly, like, I think that the request to end the trade embargo, like, it's so simple. It's just like, we don't want you in here. This is a sovereign country. You have absolutely no overview over us. You have no right to talk shit about what happens in here. You have no right. The international court has also deemed that they have no right. There is, like, the thing is, the UN cannot enforce. And I guess we all know that. So they say they're against, and then they're like, okay, but we really do not want to get into the bad side of the US. So we're just going to, like, not do anything.
Support them. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I hear a lot of Cubans are like, oh, don't worry about it. Like, they're not going to intervene in Cuba because the Russians are going in. And I was like, well, the Russians have a lot of problems in Ukraine right now. They're being blockaded by the US too. Because since the US did the exact same thing with, like, the US dollar to Russia and China, then Russia and China were like, well, we have a lot of money, so let's not trade in US dollars, let's trade in rubles and yens. And then the US was like, oh no, hell no, this is not what I meant for you to do. And they are like mad. They're like, well, Putin is like shooting at US ships that are circling like Russian territorial waters. Like they see a ship, they shoot it.
Yeah.
Because they're freaking out. And I think that, as you guys said before, like you have to see all of this in context. The protests against the government in Cuba happened like 3-4 days after the assassination of the president of Haiti. I don't think that's a coincidence.
That's not a coincidence.
I mean, I don't believe in coincidences.
No.
And I thought it's also very interesting because they did it in the worst possible circumstances. It's the middle of a pandemic. This is the first time since the revolution that Cuba has had someone in the presidency that does not belong to the historical leadership. Because Díaz-Canel was not in the Sierra Maestra. You know, like he was not in that crew. He didn't fight in the mountains. He's a technocrat raised by the revolution who has done a lot of amazing work, but everybody saw them as, I mean, it's a tough act to follow Fidel. You know? Like it is tough. It is, because he was like super hot. He was super tall. He was like super brave. He was like a badass. Oh my God. Like all of them. Just that whole imagery, it kills me every time. So a lot of people, like including my family, my mom and I, and we are like super revolutionaries, but we were like, oh, I don't know about this guy. You know, he's kind of like pudgy and, you know, like he's not dressed in olive green, and all of a sudden Cuba has like a first lady, to which I am like absolutely opposed. To me, that's like, oh, I'm gonna go to work. I'm gonna bring my mother. Why is your mom here? Yeah. Like she was fired, she wasn't elected. Why the hell is your mom here?
Yeah.
Anyway, I have a lot of beef with the guy. Not beef, but like, but then the protests happened, and I think that they happened because they thought that Díaz-Canel was gonna fold, and he didn't. He went out on television and he was like, the revolutionaries take the streets, take them. And the people followed him because he established a symbolic connection with Fidel. Because one of the things that Fidel used to do when there was like unrest in the population, he would go out to the streets. And like, if you've seen any president in any country to go out on the street in the middle of an unrest without any like security guards or like, but nothing. He would just like
70-year-old Fidel in his like little blue tracksuit and his like sneakers.
So Díaz-Canel, when the unrest started happening in Havana, people thought that he was going to hide, and he went out and he did the exact same thing Fidel used to do. He went to the heat of the situation with a guayabera, just like a white shirt, no security, like 2 or 3 guys walking around, and he just started walking. And people lost it. And all of a sudden, like his authority as the president of the country was cemented because of that symbolic act. And that's when all of the plans went to shit. And that's when they started freaking out, because people started going to the streets with like flags of the 26th of July, yelling like, Fidel! And also, Díaz-Canel, Pingu, which means Díaz-Canel, you have a big dick. It's like a good thing in Cuba. You know, like this in Havana. It was awesome. People were like super excited because all of a sudden they were like, oh no, like our president continues to be badass. All right then. And you could see like the amount of popular support the revolution has, which is also something that I think, because Cuba, like the communications that come out of Cuba, like we were talking at the beginning, they're not deemed as reliable, so they do not appear in international media. Like if you look at what's happening, like the US president is not asking Cuban officials what's going on. They're asking Florida officials what's going on. So the Cubans on the island don't really matter. Like their opinions don't matter. If they like the revolution, that doesn't matter. What matters is that the Cubans in Florida don't like the revolution.
Yeah.
So, you know, all of these protests that happen, not protests, but like the manifestations that happen in Cuba, like in support of the government, those images and those videos were used to illustrate the so-called and fake by like organic and peaceful protests against the government, which were not organic, were not peaceful, and those were definitely not the images.
Yeah.
Like I haven't seen CNN put images of the dudes who started throwing stones at the pediatric hospital, because that's what was happening. You know, so honestly, I think that at this juncture, it is a very hard situation to be in, but Cuba has been in worse situations. There's a lot of like popular support rallying around the world. There's a petition going on to the Canadian Parliament that already has like 3,000 signatures. There's a guy.
I know you have that linked in your bio. Yeah. We'll be sure to share that on our link tree as well. So if anybody's interested in signing that petition, stay tuned. We'll get it up as soon as this Charla wraps up, and you guys can hop on there and sign. What can we do?
Yeah. Sign the petition. Sign the petition and make sure that after you sign it, you send an email to your political representatives and you tell them, and it can be like municipal level, provincial level, federal level. Just let everybody know that Canada has to be consistent with their yearly vote at the United Nations. And if you condemn the trade embargo in the United Nations at the federal level, you better fucking like be consequent with it. And the good thing with Canada is one of the very few countries who has anti-blockade legislation. So there's a piece of legislation in Canada that says Canadian entities cannot obey the laws of the US blockade, except it's not very used. And part of the petition is use it.
Yeah.
Actively use it.
I also want to point out to anybody who is unfamiliar with Canadian history that that piece of legislation was signed into law by Pierre Trudeau.
Yeah. And his son should like, how Fidel went to the burial of Pierre Trudeau.
Yeah.
You know,
but Justin Trudeau is talking out of both sides of his fucking mouth. He can't decide if he's coming or going. He can open his mouth.
But isn't like
it's so frustrating.
There's that what's it called? That like stupid rumor that Fidel's his real father because of like how close the Trudeaus were.
I mean, like honestly, they look so alike, and I really wanted him to be like something. I was praying for them. Like I devoted, like no joke, I spent like 2 weeks researching this and doing like timelines and figuring out where like Margot was because I wanted him desperately to be like Fidel's. Desperately, but according to what I found out, I don't think that's possible unless there was some record of like Margaret going to Cuba in some private secret plane that I have no access to. But I don't think that's the thing. But they look so like it's crazy.
They do. Yeah.
I think still, and he also did a lot more good for the world than Justin has done, unfortunately. I mean, I get a lot of flack and a lot of death threats for being a Fidelista. Like, I've gotten like 10 in the last 2 weeks, at least. Shit, I'm going to murder you. Yeah. It's like, honestly, like the reaction of my friends here are like, oh my God, are you okay? And I always tell them the same story. Where I did my master's at Dalhousie, my supervisor there, he was very well known in the Cuban government. He does a lot of advocacy. He writes about Cuban medical brigades in English. And he used to translate for Fidel. So very well established. And he, for the 2 years that I was studying with him, he got death threats every day. Wow. Every single day. They came in the mail. They came in the email. Sometimes they send them to his daughter who was studying in the UK. Like, it was scary. And I would tell him, because it was the first time that I saw anything like that. And he would be like, oh, don't worry about it. These people never do anything. They never do anything. And it's true. They never do anything. They say they're going to do, but the thing is, if you're charging like $100 to throw a cocktail Molotov, you have no conviction. You know, you have no conviction in what you're doing. You're a mercenary. And the second they stop paying you, you're going to fold. You're going to fold like the bitch that you are.
Word. And
so, you know, like you keep getting these threats and you're like, oh, you know, you're having a mental breakdown because you're losing. Mm-hmm. And I have no doubt that we're going to come out of this. I have no doubt in my mind. We have a kick-ass government. Like, the Cuban people are crazy badass. They're laughing at this. Like, my friends are calling me and they're like, dude, the gusanos in Miami are like losing their mind. I'm like, yo. Yeah. So, you know, and I really appreciate like you guys supporting like the interest and the opportunity, because I feel that a lot of the situation right now, it's like, it's misinformation. Honestly, I don't feel it's even like, it's not that the people are not looking, is that the misinformation is so pervasive that it comes to a point that you don't even know what to look at. And I was very privileged because I had 5-6 years during my graduate degree to like go through the legislation and learn all this stuff. But Not everybody have that kind of time in their hands.
Yeah.
You know, and it is complex. It is hundreds of pieces of legislation. And there's nowhere that says specifically Cuba cannot import medical equipment. You have to infer. So you cannot use the dollars, or you cannot do this, you cannot do this other thing, and it all combines means you can't have medical equipment. But it takes a lot of rationalization and analysis to get there. And I don't think that we live in the type of world where people look at things in their feed and they're like, oh, let me look at the legislation. Oh, there's hundreds of pieces of legislation. Let me read a couple. Now, I have personally sent a link to the legislation published by the U.S. Treasury Department. It's searchable. Like, you can search, and people are like, oh, no, I don't need to look at it. I know that Cuba is a communist country, and I know that's a lie. And I was like, dude, that was published by the U.S. Treasury Department. He's like, no, it's a lie. U.S. embargo does not exist. And I was like, okay, well, you know, you're an irrational person. I obviously cannot talk to you about this.
Yeah. I'm not going to get anywhere trying to convince you. Yeah.
Well,
honestly, like, the other thing that you can do is, if you see misinformation on Instagram or Facebook or anywhere, report that. Odds are Instagram is not going to do shit about it, but still, just on principle, report that and unfollow the person.
And
because if you do that, you limit the views that these things are getting. Don't engage, don't comment. Just unfollow, report, and move on with your life, because that will damage the algorithm way more than if you start a fight on the comment section, which at the end, it doesn't matter what you say, it's still more comments for them.
Exactly.
And, you know, I've had to unfollow a number of accounts. There are so many accounts that I really thought that, like, should have known better, that are saying some pretty stupid shit, and they're pretty uninformed. And at the end of the day, it's just propaganda. They're just regurgitating propaganda on, you know, social media, passing it off as fact, and have no actual idea about the far-reaching implications of this embargo. So, you know, like I said, it's technically correct, technically speaking, that there is no embargo on, you know, food, trade, and medical supplies. But
it's not explicit. Yeah.
To present that as fact, and like that's the be-all end-all of the argument, is intellectually dishonest. And like, it's just, I just, yeah. So everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Anna, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I'm so glad that we got the chance to do this. Make sure that you're following Anna. We'll be sure to link her in the description. We'll also be linking to the petition in our link tree. If anybody has any questions, as always, send us a message. We're pretty good at responding, and we want to hear what you have to think. And if you see something, if you see some false information, make sure that you're calling it out. Make sure that we are doing everything in our power to ensure that the information that gets out there is actually accurate, and we can prevent a lot of well-meaning but clearly misinformed people from advocating for what will actually end up fucking over Latin America in the long run. So thanks, everybody. We love you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
All right.
Bye.